the male peacock's body, as it's developing, has sort of, decisions to make, in quotation marks. How big a tail do I grow? How strong am I? If I grow a tail too big, then, or even if I'm just unlucky, I'm going to end up on the wrong side of the equation and I'm just going to get eaten by something and I'm not going to reproduce at all.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. Here I am for the third time with evolutionary psychologist Dr. Dani Sulikowski, and I'm so excited for a great conversation once again. So welcome, doctor.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here.
So first, if it's okay with you, I thought I'd throw you a curveball and ask you for some personal dating advice.
That's always a dangerous question, isn't it?
So I tend to enjoy women with higher intellect, like higher on the IQ spectrum. And something I've found in dating, it's harder to get them to become interested because they tend to be more career focused and less interested in dating. So what can I do to snag a woman on the right tail of the IQ distribution?
Look, I think finding a partner is a little bit like, in an individual level, is a little bit like a dark art. Somehow, when the two of you meet, you both know. So, I'm not. I mean, I'm not sure there's much I can offer anybody in terms of my theoretical expertise of understanding how mate choice works. Then you couldn't glean yourself from your own subjective impressions. What I would say is don't waste your time chasing someone that doesn't have the same values and interests that you do, because you won't succeed in changing those. If you've got someone that is very career minded and is therefore not interested in pursuing a relationship, then some effort is warranted, because nobody gives out completely honest signals. Everybody gives out signals that are, somewhat hard to get signals, because that actually increases your apparent value on the mating market, to give out some hard to get signals. But if those signals are coming thick and fast and strong, there's probably not a lot of point you pushing against that tide.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Wow, that's yeah. So there's been like a controversy recently. I think you talked about it on Benjamin Boyce's podcast, and that was the Sydney Sweeney American Eagle ad.
It
And
did come up briefly. Yeah, it did.
yeah, so I feel like there was a number of years where a lot of these big brands were trying to push on us the idea that obesity was very beautiful, and like these things that we don't traditionally find beautiful are actually what we should find beautiful. And then kind of the Sydney Sweeney ad, which would have been not too out of the ordinary just a few years prior to that, is considered just like really shocking and jarring to us. What can you tell us about that?
So I think it's really informative to think about the narrative around female attractiveness and how that's changed. Let's just give us a span of, say, 100 years. So not quite within living memory of everyone, but not so long ago that we're not certain. First of all, I think that the idea of what big brands are pushing as attractive, I think a little bit backwards. What brands do, or what brands try to do if they're sensible, is they try to read the market and they try to give the market what they want. I mean, they also manipulate the market. Certainly, very good brands will create a niche that just wasn't there before for their product, and then look and behold, I have the perfect product for this niche, and they market it, and they can do that very successfully. But by and large, successful advertising gives its market what they want. And so whilst it was very popular, I think perhaps even going back before this, but certainly in the 80s and 90s, it was a very popular narrative that, mass media were creating body image problems for women by constantly promoting these, unhealthily thin and really highly idealistic body images that for most women were simply unattainable. But then social media came along, and then now the media that gets produced is completely distributed. It's not centralized anymore. So you no longer have a small number of media executives deciding what is the media that gets put out there. Now you have individual people deciding what gets put out there and indeed deciding what gets consumed. And the way social media works with algorithms that are individualized for each individual person, it attempts to show people the content that they're going to, maybe not the content that they would necessarily like, but certainly the content that they're going to interact with. And so what do we see proliferating on social media? All of the same, unrealistic and idealistic norms. Certainly, if we rewind just back a little bit before the body positivity movement, which I'll talk about in a minute, we rewind back a little bit before that, what did we see? All of these same highly idealistic norms being promoted. So it wasn't that mass media was creating these impossible to reach ideals and doing harm to women, nor was it the case that men were enforcing these ideals, because men's opinions of the ideal woman has never matched what women think is men's opinions of the ideal woman. So men have pretty reliable preferences for women that are, for example, heavier than what most women think would be a man's ideal preference. So it's news to most women that someone who is impossibly skinny is not actually the most physically attractive a woman could appear to a man. So what we've actually got is women driving these idealistic body images and attempting to impose them upon other women. And if we look throughout most of the last 100 years, we can see numerous examples of that, where you get these hyper skinny fads coming around that get pushed. And like all fads, especially all extreme fads, they have a limited shelf life. So you can't sort of push an unattainable ideal for forever. So you get these fads and they wax and wane. So we had, you had the Twiggy girls, which I think was probably like the 60s or 70s. And before that in the 30s, I thought you had what I think were called flapper girls, which were these hyper skinny. Then you sort of fast forward to, I don't know, the 90s, and I guess it was like heroin chic or something it was called. You had these hyper skinny ones. So we've seen wave after wave of these kinds of hyper skinny female ideals that have been promoted and pushed out there. But then something changed, right? And all of a sudden we got body positivity. And what I think changed is that for most of the last 100 years, the average woman was actually less curvy and a bit lighter than what most men would think was ideal. So, the average woman didn't have quite as curvy a bum or quite as big a boobs as perhaps most men might have liked. So if you're going to spread a body ideal that you want to actually damage women's mate value, you don't want to encourage women to be putting on weight. If putting on a little bit of weight is actually going to make them more attractive than men, you want to encourage them to be skinny. So that's why we kept seeing all of these skinny, unhealthy ideals. It's also important to remember that women's body weight is very closely linked to fertility. So you get too skinny, it's much harder to conceive. You get too fat, and it is more difficult to conceive, but it also introduces tremendous risks, especially through late pregnancy and birth. So there's a reasonably narrow weight range in which women are ideally optimized to be pregnant and have babies, and it's within that weight range where male attractiveness to female bodies also peaks for exactly that reason. So women targeting each other's weight will always have been a fruitful ground for intersexual competition, a fruitful ground for messing with other women's apparent mate value and actual fertility. So what we saw was women pressuring other women to become much skinnier than what the average men thought was peak attractiveness by convincing those women that, in fact, this ultra-thin body type is what men want. This is what makes you most attractive. However, come the sort of, I guess, early 2000s or a little bit later, people began to get big, like really big. And we reached a point where I think, I'm not sure about the stats in individual countries, but I think across most of the Western world, something like 50% of the population are, either very overweight or obese. So, it's not just a small minority of people, right? It's actually a substantial proportion. And so all of a sudden we see a couple of things. Number one, social pressure to drive women to become thin is going to be much less successful in an environment where half or more women are struggling just to achieve a healthy weight, let alone to get thin. So it's going to be a much less successful strategy. Number two, it's also a much less productive strategy. It doesn't make a lot of sense to encourage your rivals to lose weight if losing weight is going to make your rivals more attractive to the opposite sex, right? Don't interrupt your rival while they're making a terrible mistake. Just let them go, right? So all of a sudden, the idea that we would get another skinny fad would no longer be predicted. And indeed, what did we see? We see body positivity and exactly what you've described, where we see this promotion of these unhealthily and therefore unattractively heavy, primarily women, to some extent men, but primarily women, being presented in the media and being lauded and celebrated as beautiful. And it's partly a body weight thing, as I've described, but I also think it fits within a broader social, I'm not quite sure of the word, but movement's wrong, but within a broader social context of inversion around attractiveness norms. So we can explain the celebration of unhealthily fat body types from the perspective of female intersexual competition and weight manipulation being a tool, a tool in that belt, and always has been. But I think it's also in the context of there being broader inversion around attractiveness norms, where things that are not attractive, that are objectively and sort of by consensus not attractive, being celebrated and framed as attractive, whilst things that actually are attractive and therefore are things that are linked with fertility and linked with health types of cues that have always been attractive, are being condemned and shunned as being, if not unattractive, certainly inappropriate or somehow or rather undesirable. Anyway, and then you sort of get in the middle of this, or perhaps we are at the end of the body positivity peak, or the end of this kind of morbidly obese celebrating peak, because again, anything that is that extreme can't last forever. People realize, they become dissatisfied with it, and we've started to see some of the people who are perhaps some of the loudest voices out there celebrating being really heavy, like Lizzo is the obvious one that comes to mind, who then all of a sudden very publicly went, actually, this is not good. This is not healthy, and I'm not going to do this anymore. So we sort of saw, perhaps the body positivity movement rounding up a little bit. And then in the context of the American political scene, we're seeing a lot more pushback, I think, in America than we are certainly in Australia or the UK or the rest of Europe. From what I can tell, I'm not in all those countries, obviously, but from what I can tell, there's much more pushback in America that's sort of gone along with the rise of right-wing politics a little bit more, and the election of Donald Trump, the public sort of takedown of gender ideology, which is also wrapped up in that same type of thing. A lot of these things are now being sort of very publicly and very openly pushed back against, whereas they weren't just a few years ago. And so now we're sort of seeing in that context this Sydney Sweeney ad. And it's interesting. I've heard people say, and I suspect they're right, that the advertisers that put that ad together did so in the full knowledge of the social backlash that it would get, and that there's no such thing as bad publicity. And I suspect that's right. I find it difficult to believe that they would come up with a tagline of Sydney Sweeney has great genes and not link that to the fact that the far left, who they knew full well was going to be very dissatisfied with this, the promotion of such a conventionally attractive young woman. I find it hard to believe that they didn't also foresee a link being drawn between that advertisement and Nazis. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they didn't know that was also going to be where the far left went on this. But I suspect they knew what they were doing, and and fair enough to them. It's a ridiculous link to draw. But they may well have known it was going to happen. It's also worth pointing out that the whole premise of someone wearing jeans and talking about having excellent genes and having a pun is also not new. So there is an ad that someone's ripped up from either the 80s or the 90s, and I forget the supermodel who's in it, but there is someone in such an ad squeezing into an incredibly tight pair of jeans, making all the same comments. So it's not even an original idea, right? It's a recycled idea. So it's not even original, but I suspect they perhaps had some idea of the furor that it would very predictably cause amongst those who have invested a lot in inverting the publicly acceptable image of what is an attractive woman.
Hmm.
And it did.
So, one thing I wanted to comment on that body positivity movement, and I think this kind of goes back to some of our previous conversations about female intersectional competition, is a lot of the kind of upper middle class, college educated women who were the thought leaders driving the body positivity movement were themselves much more likely to have a healthy BMI. So it was kind of like walk one way, talk a different way.
Yeah, and I think, and that's, I mean, that's a really important observation, not just for body positivity, but for female intersexual competition generally. So one of the most effective ways to manipulate the behavior of women is to, and we see this with women being far more susceptible than men to social contagions, right? So it's not surprising that women are far more susceptible to the social contagion of anorexia and other eating disorders that really took off in, they weren't unheard of before then, but they really took off in the 90s. I think it was the 90s. I think I've got that time around about right. And similarly, we've seen with the gender dysphoria social contagion. That was always back when it affected a very small number of people and wasn't as in the social, a big part of the social narrative. Gender dysphoria was always more common in men than in women. But when we see it become now a social flashpoint, all of a sudden we've now see referrals to the gender clinics being much more common in young girls than in young boys. So, and that's sort of just two examples, but you can look at it anyway. If you look at women's fashion, how often it changes and how much more compelled women are to follow fashion trends than men are, and you see that in the availability of women's clothing and how often it changes and how much more of it women consume compared to men. So you can see female susceptibility to social contagions everywhere that you look, and therefore, one of the best ways to manipulate female behavior is to create a social norm that it is cool or fashionable or, whatever word you want to put there, attractive for women to follow.
Mm.
And this creates a tension between those who wish to promote these norms, but to not actually bear the cost of having to embody them. Right. And so you do get the ideal way to play the intersexual competition game from that perspective is, as you say, to very, very strongly promote these ideals, but to not actually embody them yourself. But the most attractive way to promote them, or the most effective way to promote them, I should say, is to embody them. And so the women who wish to, so the women I think who have less social clout, less social capital, and feel very strongly like they just need to embody whatever norm is out there just to fit in. They're very highly motivated to fit in, and they're the ones who are being repeatedly damaged by these social norms, these damaging social norms and these social contagions, and they are really susceptible to them and just do them, and it causes them tremendous damage. The women who are much higher up in the hierarchy have got a little bit more of a balancing game to play. To what extent do they embody them in a cheap way, or do they promote these norms in a cheap way that doesn't actually impact them, but then also really makes themselves an example of how not to embody these norms and still be supposedly, on the right team, versus actually embodying them to some extent without doing too much damage. So there's a important trade-off for women to play in that ground, and where different women sit in that trade-off is sort of an interesting observation. So I haven't seen any data on sort of how you compare, the number of women who are espousing these body positivity motives, and looking at whether or not they are in fact statistically more likely to be thinner or fat or whatever. It'd be very difficult data to collect. Any data where you need to get genuine population representative data is really hard to get. So it's difficult to know whether those women actually would be heavier or thinner overall. Perhaps it's the ones who really strongly promote these norms but don't embody them that create a certain level of hypocrisy that we then notice, and so they stand out more. It's difficult to tell, but certainly there is a tension between embodying and promoting if you want to effectively compel other women to follow these types of damaging trends.
Hmm. So earlier you were talking about the Sydney Sweeney ad was referencing a previous ad, I think from the 80s or 90s.
Mm.
Rusty in the chat said it was Brooke Shields for Calvin Klein was the ad.
Yeah, that's about right. I saw someone replay it a little while ago. Someone dug it up and had it posted somewhere, so I saw it, but I couldn't recall. That does sound right.
So I want to come at the Sydney Sweeney ad if we continue beating this dead horse.
Yeah.
Come at the Sydney Sweeney ad for from the male side. I've heard a number of men say Sydney Sweeney is mid. Like she's just an average looking, well, she's clearly an extremely attractive woman. Is there some strategy from these type of men saying, this woman is below average, therefore, if you're less than her, you should probably want to settle for me? Does that make sense?
I think, yeah, look, I think it's interesting. I've actually heard men say the same thing, and the thing is, because of sex differences in attractiveness judgments, I don't necessarily trust my own judgment and whether or not the fact that I would say that she's well above average, whether or not that actually is a reliable indicator of the average man saying that she's well above average. Certainly, from a perspective of what we know about what makes people attractive, she looks very attractive. She's blonde, that's attractive. She's young, that's attractive. Her body shape is unarguably attractive. Her face is quite symmetrical, that's attractive. She has quite feminine features, large eyes and high cheekbones and whatever else. I mean, by all conventional standards, she's attractive. I genuinely don't know whether people, whether they be men or not, claiming that she's actually just mid. I don't know if that reflects a either conscious or not conscious attempt to downgrade her attractiveness. If it does, then one possibility is that it is, as you say, an attempt to kind of place, to recalibrate women's idea of what is attractive. That could be it. I suspect, though, my thinking would be that it's probably a better explanation to think that what men might be doing by saying, oh, look, she's really just mid. I think what is more likely is that these men are actually indicating their commitment to the attractiveness in inversion memes that are floating around. So, the kind of the celebration of all these things that are not attractive and calling them attractive. And so thus, by taking someone who appears by all objective data up and would have been by consensus up until about 5 seconds ago pretty much considered universally attractive, by saying, yeah, look, she's not really that hot. What those men, I suspect, are signaling to women, if anything, is, yeah, I don't adhere to these, patriarchal attractiveness norms. That's not what I go for. So, if you've got something else to bring to the table, then, I'd like to see what you've got. And if that's true, if that's accurate, then that would predict that the men most likely to say that are probably the men for whom highly attractive women are not really in their league. Because if you're trying to draw highly attractive women, it's a cope, but it is not just a cope. It's an attempt to position yourself in the market towards in the appropriate place, so that you're positioning yourself towards appropriate mates. So if you're trying to attract, if you think that you are a rank 10 and you're trying to attract another 10 out of 10, you're not going to point to a 10 out of 10 as like an example and say, not for me, right? So, but however, if you're, say, a 5 and you want to market yourself to other 5s, maybe 6s, everybody likes to aim up a little bit, want to market yourself to other 5s, maybe 6s, when someone shows you a 10, you're not going to go, oh yeah, wow, she's beautiful, she's attractive, she's exactly what I want, because a whole bunch of 5s and 6s will look at you saying that and go, yeah, well, he's clearly not going to want me then. So it's about advertising your own position on the mating market and making sure that you are seen potentially as being attainable by the kinds of people that you would like to attain. So, I do have some data that I published with an honours student of mine suggesting that people do adjust their preferences to match their own mate value. So people are not necessarily lying if they themselves are kind of mid, and they're not necessarily being dishonest when they say that they find someone else from the opposite sex who's also just kind of mid. They find that person to be a more attractive prospective partner than if you show them a 10 out of 10. They actually do adjust their preferences to match what they can attain, which
Ah.
makes sense because there's no point someone wasting their time trying to attract a mate that they're never going to get. So it would be adaptive to adjust your preferences for what is kind of the best mate that you could realistically hope to attain. So,
Do you think this mate preference adaptation is conscious or unconscious?
our data in that particular study suggested that it wasn't conscious. So people are not consciously saying, oh, well, look, yeah, she's obviously hot, but I'd much prefer this rather normal girl next door looking girl. She just seems more appealing to me. People are not lying about that. So it's not that they can't perceive that someone like Sydney Sweeney or anyone else who's incredibly attractive. It's not that they can't perceive, oh yeah, I can see why people might think she's hot. But when they contemplate thinking about that person as a partner and rating their attractiveness as a prospective partner, that doesn't appeal to them. And so what appeals to them much more is somebody who they think they would be much better suited to. That to them, it looks like would be a much more worthwhile relationship to them. That's a much better catch as far as they're concerned. And so you can understand that the logic that people would work through on that. If you're a guy who's a solid 6 or 7, what there's not going to be a lot of there's not a lot of good prospects for you if you go and pair up with a woman who's a 10 out of 10, that the odds of desertion are quite high. And similarly, if you're a woman who's a solid 6 or 7, if somehow you manage to pull a guy who is a solid 10, the odds of desertion are pretty high. So it makes sense that people's mate preferences are going to be targeted towards getting them the best mate that they can attain, but not driving them towards, mate pursuits that are just going to end in desertion as the most likely outcome, if indeed they get off the ground at all.
Wow, that's very interesting. Um, Man, yeah, I feel like there's a lot there. I had a question, it just slipped my mind. Um, we can go to our next topic, which is kind of these reality TV dating shows. And I wanted to start with Married at First Sight. We talked a little bit about this one last time, and I wanted to dig into it more. Like, I was thinking, historically, a lot of traditional societies have had arranged marriages, but the families were doing the arranging. And now with Married at First Sight, it's the experts who arrange your marriage. I think it's a psychologist, a sociologist, and a pastor will arrange your marriage for you. And then we
Wow.
have cameras like watching you as this kind of implodes. Tell me about Married at First Sight.
As it implodes. Yeah, look, so I mean, look, the dating shows are fascinating sometimes. I've never watched, so I don't know if I would enjoy them or not, but I've never found appealing the ones where the ads always have sort of half naked people on them or whatever. So I haven't really watched those ones. I think like Love Island is one or something, I
Yeah.
think. But I literally know it only from the ads, so I don't really have a perspective on that. But I will confess to having watched quite a few series of Married at First Sight, because I find them inherently interesting. I think there's a couple of things to remember. So I don't know if this is true, but I've heard it, and it seems about right. So I think that on what I've heard from these shows is that when they're choosing contestants, they do a bunch of personality batteries of these contestants, and they don't want normal people, because normal people just do normal things, and they're boring, and so you don't get any spice. So they don't want anyone from like the middle of the distribution. They also don't want anyone from this too extreme tail end of the distribution, because that could go really badly. And on rare occasions of that show, it does look like it has gone very badly. So again, I don't know if it was true, but there was an accusation of rape on one of the Australian series. I don't know if it was true. I don't think it was ever formally made, so it was kind of a bit of a rumor. But either way, whether it was true or not, you would say that a bad choice of contestant has been made, because you've either chosen a man who's raped someone, or you've chosen a woman who's made that false accusation. So either way, you've probably made a bad choice. That's not the kind of drama that they actually want. There was also another series it was one of the UK ones, where they actually asked a couple to leave, and it was very clear, I think, to anybody watching that, that the man in that particular couple had been, like, what's called love bombing the woman, and so the first, like, their honeymoon and whatever was just like, and she was all caught up in it as well. So they were just, completely love bombing each other, and she was absolutely, utterly smitten. And almost as soon as they sort of came back from their honeymoon and were then moving into the apartment, he was just sort of insulting her at every turn and undercutting her confidence and everything. And it was clear that the experts must have seen that, and they didn't choose to intervene, but they just told them that, look, we don't think this relationship is healthy, and they just made them leave the show. And that was it. It was just, we're just asking you to leave. And neither wanted to, because I think she thought that she was still in love with him, in spite of the fact that he'd started doing all these, horrible things to her and making her really upset. And of course, that was, I suspect, for him, perhaps his normal relationship MO, and so he perhaps thought everything was going well. I don't know. So that they clearly make mistakes, but so it's not the sort of, genuinely harmful drama they want. But they want someone, or ideally many someones, in that kind of middle period, that middle part of the one half of the distribution, right? Not the middle, but shifted towards one side, but just not too far. So people that are, a collection of people who are all just, a little bit to the side of normal, a little bit outside what you would, capable of behaviors that most people would probably not do under most circumstances. So then you get a lot of drama, and you get a lot of, outrageous kind of behaviors where people kind of think, think I'd do that. And that's how they make their drama. So I think it's important to remember that you're not watching just a regular selection of, any regular selection of people, where I think most kinds of crowds of people, the center of gravity would be hovering around normal, and then you'd get outliers in both directions. These are groups of people who've been chosen for their center of gravity on, particularly sort of reactive and dramatic personality traits to be, definitely shifted, left or right of center, depending on which direction they want to go. But it does create, it creates amazing drama. And I will confess, I do, when I watch this show, because we stream it, and so we can pause it. And my poor husband, I think, is a bit tired of me using Married at First Sight as teachable moments. Pausing it and explaining what this person's actually doing, or what that person, and yeah. It's interesting from a kind of mating psychology perspective. I think he'd probably prefer just to be allowed to watch the show.
Oh, wow. And have you ever watched Love is Blind?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so that on
What's
that
the
one,
premise?
they're talking to each other like through a wall, so you get a lot of audible
Yeah.
communication, like vocalizing communication with each other, but you can't see the other person. So in
Okay.
terms of like stuff we're talking about from evolutionary psychology, does this person have good genetics? You can pick up on like their verbal fluency, which might correlate with IQ, which has some genetic heritability, or some degree of emotional stability, which is somewhat genetically heritable. But there's a lot of cues that visual information gives you that you are not getting. And you get a lot of really shocked responses when people think
Yes.
they fall in love with someone based on the sound of their voice, and they see them and they have a completely different opinion.
Yes, I can imagine. So, I mean, effectively what that is it's just, as you said, it's just cue deprivation. So, it's giving people access to a whole bunch of cues, but obviously depriving them of access to a lot of important information that their brain's going to use to judge a prospective partner's mate value and viability as a partner. And so, I imagine what probably happens is that people, everybody on these shows, they go there because they want to meet a partner. So we already have a motivated population of people who are going to be motivated to, in the absence of information to the contrary, they're going to be motivated to start from a starting point that these people are a really good match to them. I don't know about this particular one, but certainly on Married at First Sight, a big part of the narrative of that show, at least, is the idea that the experts have matched you. So the show kind of rests on this premise, for better or worse, for the people involved in it, that regardless of your initial responses to your partner, regardless of what you might think, and regardless of how your opinion develops as you get to know them better, somehow if you don't like them, then maybe there's something wrong with you and your judgment, because the experts have said that you're a fantastic match, right? And I don't know about this Love is Blind one, but I imagine there may be a similar type of premise that some kind of pre-matching has happened beforehand, so that when people then get partial cues, some of which they may perceive positively, it's very easy for them to go, yeah, this is a good match. This is a really good match. And to build up a level of excitement and a level of, confidence in how good the person will actually be as a match for them, that they probably wouldn't have in the real world. So if you met someone in the real world, and you only spoke to them over the phone, you would probably not get as excited about them as a prospective partner as you do when you're on this show and you're kind of in this big moment where this person is going to be your true love. And same on Married at First Sight, right? Everything is packaged in this whole kind of, we have found you, the perfect match for you. And I mean, I do find it quite, I will admit, I find it quite funny on Married at First Sight. I think they do themselves a tremendous disservice, but I guess they don't want to let, contestants who they think are going to make good television go out too early. But I've now seen it happens it's not actually that uncommon for, unsurprisingly, you grab a whole bunch of, similarly aged single adults and you shove them together, and sometimes the pairs that they have arbitrarily, maybe not arbitrarily, but I certainly have my doubts about the scientific validity of the matching process, so it might not be entirely arbitrary, that might be unfair, but I don't think it's fantastic. It's really unsurprising that you end up with people being mutually attracted to each other who were not actually matched, and so you always end up with affairs and whatnot. And I find it hilarious when two people have had an affair or something, or maybe they deny having had an affair during the show, but they both, write leave and them and their respective partners leave. But then in the next episode, two of those previously unmatched people are then magically welcomed back. And somehow every time the experts confirm that they've gone back and looked at their data and, yeah, you two actually really are a good match. Like I've never heard them say, look, no, we've looked at our data and we're not going to invite you back as a couple because we don't actually think you're that well matched. Never happens, right? Which I think gives you some insight into the reliability and the validity of their matching process. But there you go. So yeah, the show, the whole context of the show sets up expectations, unrealistic expectations in the contestants of the likelihood of, I think, certain matches working out. And then of course when you've got that kind of biased, Bayesian prior, if you like, your prior assumptions of what you think is going to happen, when that has been massively biased toward a relationship working out, then you're going to try a lot harder in the context of the show for that to work out. And I guess in the Love is Blind one, that can all come crashing down quite quickly once you see what they look like. Whereas the Married at First Sight one, I think certainly there have been relationships that have broken down effectively at first sight, like people have just turned around and gone, oh no. But for the most part, people do persevere for some period of time, at least, in those relationships.
So we talked about the people on the show and the people who produce the show, but what about you and me, the people who watch the show? What is going on in our individual psychology as we watch these other people playing these games, essentially?
So I think there's a couple of things, and one is the social utility of gossip, and this is certainly stereotypically applies more to women than men, but I don't think the sex difference is actually as large as that. Certainly gossip has social utility for men as well. So, men having the inside track or knowing about someone else's relationship in their social group comes with a certain level of kudos as well. So I think people are just, the fact that these shows are about relationships. So, you do see other reality TV shows that are not about relationships, but they're generally not about things that people find tedious and things that people wouldn't gossip about. So that the fact that these are about the types of things that people would gossip about if you knew these people, I think is what gives them appeal, because by watching the show, you do feel as though you at least know these people in some respect. And if other people also watch the show and you have an opportunity to talk to those people, this does create a social motivation to have the gossip and to know what's going on. And of course, the way the shows are presented, sort of rolling out in more or less a chronological fashion, it's a little bit, a lot like, I guess, watching a real relationship rollout, where you have that opportunity to gossip with other people who are also watching it and try to work out, is it going to last? Is it not going to last? I saw that social cue and I think that means this. I think, this is going to be what happens, blah, 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 blah. So I think there is just an inherent value of gossip and television shows like this that present you with these people, tell you a little bit about their background, effectively introduce them to you now as a social acquaintance, and that gives what happens to these people, that gives the information about what's happening to them some social utility. So we're drawn to watch it and we enjoy watching these things unfold. And then I think the other side of it that is inherently valuable as well is that I think all people, this is something that you see just social friends doing in real life as well. People enjoy comparing and get a lot of value out of comparing their own interactions with the interactions of other relationships. So when you see other people doing the same things to what you do in your relationship, well, that's, it can have one or two effects. I guess in some senses, it can make you feel comfortable to know that that's normal, those types of disagreements or, whatever it might be that you're observing. Or depending on just how dysfunctional the relationship is you're watching that now mimics parts of your relationship, it might be like more of a red flag and less of a comfort. But in any case, I think people also are quite highly motivated. Certainly, I think women are quite highly motivated to watch other people's relationships and to watch them succeed and to watch them fail, to effectively learn about what are the signs of success and the signs of failure. So there is like a social learning aspect of it as well, I think. And that's sort of, I think that sort of speaks to, you come up with lots of examples. The one that sort of comes to mind, to some extent, is the tendency that a lot of women have to hide darker aspects of their relationship. So a lot of women, particularly victims of domestic abuse and domestic violence, and perhaps to some extent, domestic violence as well, I guess. But I think before a relationship potentially gets violent, but there might be red flags or signs, women are compelled, I think, to hide those so that their relationship looks good to the outside world. They don't want other people seeing those cues. They want their relationship to look wonderful and fantastic. And of course, if as a victim of that kind of, whether you're a woman or a man, as a victim of that kind of behavior, if you make active steps to hide it and conceal it from people, that then works into the hands of the person who's behaving like that, because that makes it easier for them to treat you like that without other people knowing. And of course, other people knowing is frequently what will ultimately, result in some sort of an intervention that will then, dissolve that relationship somehow, friends or family seeing what's going on, recognizing the red flags. But if both parties, for completely different motives, are trying to actually hide what's going on, that's obviously much easier for someone to get away with that kind of conduct than if the person you're doing it to was sort of very compelled to go out and tell everyone that this is what had happened. So, people definitely do watch each other's relationships and they guard the secrets of their own relationships quite closely. So when you get an opportunity to watch two people ostensibly in a private conversation, albeit with, a camera sitting right there, you feel like you're getting an insight into the parts of their relationship that they would normally you would not get an insight into. So, and I think that's quite attractive too, the fact that you're getting obviously, of course, the reality shows heavily curate the content that you see. I'm not suggesting that they don't. Of course they do, but they try to make it look like they don't. Like one of my favorite tricks of them doing that, and once you notice it, you realize how often they do this, and it's so often. They'll have two people talking, and they're clearly mic'd up, right? So you can hear them talking, but the shot they then cut to is a shot of a camera really far away, peeking through some trees, and they're kind of out of focus, and it kind of draws back in, then it gets them in focus, and then they turn the sound right down and they put the the words across the screen as though they can't really hear properly, so they've got to do subtitles. You're like, hang on a minute ago, like 5 seconds ago you were filming them like a meter away and they were fully mic'd up and we could hear them clearly. Why is it now all of a sudden you're pretending that they're not mic'd up in the same conversation? Yeah, but it's to create the impression that these two people were trying to have a private conversation in that moment, but it's being captured anyway. Like, and once you realize them doing that, and once you see it, like I said, once you see it, you can't unsee it. You realize how often they actually use that tactic to create the impression for the audience that they were actually trying to have a quiet moment in that particular thing, but we caught them anyway. And so, yeah.
So a minute ago, we were talking about, how accurate are the experts' projections when they're trying to match people up based on compatibility. In the chat, we've got Jonathan Cogburn, who's a marriage and family therapist, who says, my understanding of the Gottman's research, I think that's John and Julie Gottman, the love researchers, Gottman's research had shown years ago that compatibility surveys had no predictive value for relationship outcomes within the data set. If that's true, then a match becomes an interesting concept.
That doesn't surprise me in the slightest. I'm not as familiar with that research, but that is my basic understanding of it. That matchmaking is pointless. There are some predictors of relationship satisfaction and relationship duration, but my understanding is that most of those boil down to indicators of equal mate value. So as long as both partners in the relationship attain approximately equal mate value, there's a higher chance of relationship satisfaction and a higher chance of relationship duration than if either they're unmatched to begin with or if something happens. So, if you get two people who are both kind of shy and not very social, or perhaps don't meet a lot of prospective partners, perhaps both are quite ostensibly unattractive, they might both be quite overweight, they get together, they pair up, and then one of them loses a lot of weight and all of a sudden goes from being a bit of a wallflower to being a stunner. Well, now you've got a big mismatch in attractiveness and therefore a big mismatch in apparent mate value. A similar thing, similar sort of things can happen when people get together quite young. And so you might have, two people who are perhaps not especially, not especially physically attractive, just kind of regular, normal people who get together, and things are going quite well. And then maybe, he lands a really, really high paying job. And all of a sudden he goes from being mid and average to being incredibly wealthy. And thus he has access to a whole bunch of much higher mate value mates than he had access to when he chose her. So to the best of my knowledge, which granted is quite limited in terms of like research in that formal matchmaking, dating, marriage space, which is largely not evolutionarily motivated. I don't think there's great evidence that matchmaking is successful. But in terms of mate value, that's the kind of thing that people need to maintain matched on. If they maintain matched on that, then the relationship has a higher a higher prospect of success, which does really make sense. I think that's what you would predict.
Yeah. So we had a comment when I had posted the question, what do you want me to ask Dr. Sulikowski? I posted this on Twitter, and somebody was talking about, like, the gist of their comment was about poisoning the well. So in our previous conversations, we talked about how feminism is walk one way, speak another way. So have an abortion, don't have sex with your husband. But meanwhile, I'm going to be doing all those. I'm going to have as many kids as I can. You know what I mean? So that you kind of skew that ratio of reproductive success. But one of the things this person had brought up, a person, kind of this, say, upper middle class, college educated, feminist woman is, has a traditional home life and everything while they're preaching feminism. But what if they have a transgender son who wants to, or transgender child, either way, who wants to sterilize themselves, right? Or they have a daughter who wants to have an abortion, because they've put these ideas, even though they're not practicing these ideas, they've put these ideas out into the stream, and their kids are following these ideas. So now their genetic line has stopped, even though they're kind of, does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think, I think it comes back to that tension between signaling something and actually embodying it being the most effective way to signal it. And I think that there's there's that phenomenon. So someone actually running the risk of putting all these ideas out there, and then, these social contagions infecting their own children, and that, sort of obviously being a reproductive net loss. But I guess the thing to remember is that in all of these sorts of games, and they all are games in the game theory kind of sense, right? The outcomes are all contingent on what other people do and how other people respond. If you do something that is going to lower your own reproductive success in the hope that it lowers others' reproductive success more and it doesn't, well, then you've just kicked a massive own goal. So this is all quite complicated, interrelated strategies that are playing out. So yeah, one is the risk that, you will sort of, I forget if there's a phrase that came to mind, but it's quite vulgar. I'm trying to think of the unvulgar version, but I can't. But anyway, yeah, there's a chance that you might ruin things for yourself, right? By doing that. But the other side of it that I've also kind of thought a little bit about lately, if not too much, is the kind of fact that people do that to their own children kind of deliberately as a virtue signal. So, if, you see the Hollywood celebrities all out there with, all of their trans kids. And I think it's always dangerous to look at individual anecdotes and try to sort of build theory of them. So it's just an example. But I think that her name escapes me now, but the woman who was in Sex and the City, the redheaded one, and she quite sort of famously gave a speech a little while ago at a protest rather, explaining how, like, her child, her sister's child, her best friend's child, and all of her child's friends are all trans. And it's like, well, what's the likelihood of that happening as a whole series of independent cases, given the proportion of kids who actually, even now, if we take the sort of social contagion numbers, it's still a relatively small proportion of individuals that identify as that. Now, what is the odds that everybody in that social group has done that independently? Like, very, very low, right? So clearly we sort of, and from that, what most people conclude and what people, frequently state, and appears to be true, is that it's primarily the mothers that are driving the transition of these young children and encouraging it. And so that becomes, a very dangerous double-edged sword to play. So on the one hand, you've got someone who is potentially either permanently or maybe momentarily or maybe just partially damaging the fertility and whatever of their own child, in order to push what ostensibly they will evolutionarily hope, not implying anything conscious, but what they will evolutionarily hope will become a social contagion that will affect other people much more than it will ultimately affect them. And so you sort of got them, sort of transing their own kids as a virtue signal to push this highly damaging thing. But of course, that is wearing a massive own goal. As well, because that's doing genuine harm to your own reproductive success. So it's not just that your own kids might do one of these, really reproductively limiting acts, or make one of those reproductively limiting decisions that you've been, espousing for a long time, but have no intention of doing yourself. That there's also the kind of flip side to that, where people will go further than just espousing these ideas, but they will actually embody them to some extent. And then you've got a sort of a trade-off, where you've got how much do you embody this, voluntarily, and how much cost do you bear to try to really demonstrate just how committed you are, which is the other side of a costly signal. So one of the reasons why costly signals evolve is because they impose a cost on you, either on your survival or on your reproduction, but you also get rewarded. So if we just think very simply about the peacock's tail, right? The peacock's tail imposes a survival cost, harder for the peacock to run away from something that's going to want to eat it. It also imposes something of a reproductive cost, because a great big tail like that, if the peacock is infested with parasites or something, well, they're not going to be able to hide that, right? It's going to be very obvious, and it's going to be displayed. So the peacock's tail becomes something of a costly signal, but the male peacocks with the biggest tails are the ones that get the most peahens. So I was going to say female peacocks, but that's not how that works. Get the most peahens, right? And so, yes, so they impose a cost, but that cost is more than compensated for by the rewards of having a tail for the ones that have the biggest tail and can actually afford to have it. So the male peacock's body, as it's developing, has sort of, decisions to make, in quotation marks. How big a tail do I grow? How strong am I? If I grow a tail too big, then or even if I'm just unlucky, I'm going to end up on the wrong side of the equation and I'm just going to get eaten by something and I'm not going to reproduce at all, right? So, the individuals in both a kind of behavioral sense and a developmental sense have to make decisions about how much of any particular costly trait they're going to try and display. And of course, the rewards from the rest of the social group for displaying those traits, is hopefully going to outweigh the cost of displaying them, but won't always. And so this is sort of part of this intersexual competition game. If we sort of accept that women who are out there talking about, even the women who talk about how many abortions they've had and how many, and how proud they are of their daughter for having an abortion when she got pregnant when she shouldn't have, and all these sorts of things, there is always a tension, and you shouldn't assume that just because someone is behaving like this, that they're going to end up on the right side of the equation at the end. The whole point of the game is a lot of people play it and not everyone wins. So, it is a costly game. You don't necessarily engage in all these behaviors, be really pro-trans, pro-abortion, anti-natal, whatever it might be, and win the game by having a lot of kids. A lot of people play this game and ultimately lose. That's kind of the nature of the game.
Mm. We got a question about cuttlefish and kangaroos mating habits. I'm assuming the one about the cuttlefish is like this: the smaller cuttlefish will kind of actually shift their body to try to look like a female and sneak into kind of the harem and impregnate females. If they get caught, the larger males will kill them. I feel like I think that's what's going on. Do you have any thoughts on that type of reproductive strategy?
Yeah, look, people have pointed that out. So that's sort of called the sneaker male strategy. And people have pointed that out, and they've suggested, I've heard that applied to male homosexuality as an evolutionary explanation of male homosexuality. That what these men are doing is obviously that they're not fooling anyone that they're women, but what they're doing is embodying a bunch of feminine traits. There certainly is a stereotype, if not an accurate perception, that women very much enjoy having gay male friends, and they tend to be invited into a social circle that would otherwise be heavily female dominated, if not exclusively female. How true that actually is versus it just being a stereotype that's only maybe a little bit true, it's hard to say. But I've heard that put out before to sort of explain male homosexuality as a mating strategy. It's a way for men to ingratiate themselves with women in a way that the women's guard doesn't get put up, because they don't see these men as prospective mates, and so they don't evaluate them that way, and they don't kind of push them away the way they would set up boundaries around straight males that they see as prospective mates who they are not interested in, who they feel are giving them too much attention, right? So they're not going to put those boundaries up. For something like that to work, and I think this is sort of the argument for it, for something like that really to work, obviously these gay men have to ultimately have sex with these women, which is kind of what gay men tend not to want to do. It doesn't. That's kind of the where that sort of theory breaks down a bit. Although, I don't think it's true. Like, I think there are problems with the theory. I'm not that convinced by it. But the argument, which is not ridiculous, to account for that is that in the majority of societies where homosexuality is sufficiently shunned, and certainly there's plenty of evidence of this in our society from before homosexuality was considered acceptable, plenty of examples of gay men getting married because of the social pressure to get married. So, maybe it's not so absurd to think that in a society where homosexuality was shunned and would be, where you might even, face either a death penalty or, social ostracization that was as good as a death penalty, for being gay, maybe these gay men would have these feminine traits, ingratiate themselves with women, and then end up partnering up with some of those women. I'm not quite sure that it works like that, but that is a theory that I've heard people put out there.
I feel like this theory would apply rather than to gay men. I think it would apply better to me with kind of your heterosexual progressive male feminists. Like, hey, ladies, I'm an ally. I'm here to dismantle the patriarchy. You can let your guard down and let me into your club. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think, that's certainly been suggested before as well. Not so much as sort of in the context of like comparing it to sneaker males or males that try to look like females in the animal kingdom, but certainly it's been suggested that the male endorsement or male public endorsement of feminism is nothing more than just signaling to women that, yep, I'm one of the good ones. I'm not one of the bad ones. I'm not gonna beat you up, and I don't endorse beating you up either.
You still there? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, I just lost you for a couple of seconds, only just a
Yeah,
couple.
yeah. Yeah, okay. I think they liked that in the chat. They said, so there was another one. It's kind of similarly along the lines of like poisoning the well. But you had posted or kind of replied to a video, I think, recently about, climate change is this existential threat, and it would be irresponsible to have children, while climate change is killing the planet. That seems like a particularly effective and also nefarious strategy to get other people to stop having kids.
Yeah, so look, I mean, look, my like a lot of people, I'm not certainly not alone in this, but my level of skepticism about how reliable the climate science and climate narrative is has taken a massive hit. It took a massive hit around the time the same people who are saying, just how dire the climate situation is going to get also told me that women can have penises. Around about that time I thought maybe we might want to reconsider, how prone the academy has become to ideology. And look, there's no denying, I think that, the notion of climate change has certainly become a highly politicized, um, sort of, it's taken on a life of its own, right? It's not just, about sort of, looking at emissions, working out what our emissions are doing to the planet, and then working out what we need to do if we want to kind of slow that process down a bit. Like, it's become an entire political behemoth of its own, right? And it's melded into the omnichores, like Greta Thunberg standing there in a cafe, howling about whatever it is that she howls about. That's kind of like the ultimate sort of collapse of these causes. Like, they've all just become one, this sort of left wing omnicause, and there's very little differentiation between them, even when they're completely incompatible. Like, I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, but I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that I don't think net zero is of much importance to the people of Gaza. Right, I'm pretty
Mm.
sure that's not really what they're strongly focused on. So if you're Greta Thunberg and you have dedicated your whole young life ostensibly to raising concerns about climate change and the impacts of climate change and wanting to fight for that, how is it that you have all of a sudden almost entirely abandoned that and pivoted to now become a shrill mouthpiece for? So, I think it's hopefully, I think to most people who are looking at this objectively, regardless of what you used to think, currently think, or aren't really sure about in terms of what we actually face as a world with climate change, I think most people should be able to agree that it has become rolled into the left-wing omnicores now, which just makes it incredibly difficult to get anything that is limited by evidence out of people, because the political motives are just so strong around what people say. So, yes, and you're right, what that means is that this whole notion that you can't or you shouldn't have children because of the contribution of that to climate change and whatever, of course, has now, become a narrative of increasing voice in left-wing circles. So I don't know of anyone that has gone and tried to collect objective data on this. There's a few qualitative studies I've read, but a student of mine is actually currently doing her honours project on exactly this research question. So we will shortly have data that we can speak to about the extent to which there is a relationship between climate concerns and opinions and attitudes about the environment versus climate anxiety, and whether or not that actually leads to antinatalist views in any kind of a statistically meaningful way. Like, is this a very fringe narrative that is just not really what people are thinking about, or has this become a train of thought that is now sufficiently common that we can identify it in a large sample of survey respondents? We will have data on that soon, but certainly, like one of the Australian news broadcaster, Sky News, did a piece on this idea a few weeks ago. This video that you're talking about, that's an Australian influencer who put that video out. So certainly in Australia, that this idea of not having children because of climate change appears to be gaining traction. I think it's gaining traction in other parts of the world too. It'll be interesting to see whether it actually turns up in data, whether it's not so fringe that we can actually identify a substantial number of people sort of pointing in that direction.
So this seems like a very confusing and difficult game to play, because on the one hand, like, being accepted by the tribe is very important. Being welcomed into the tribe gives you protection and safety and resources. Being ostracized from the tribe, you're left to fend for yourself. And so if I'm wanting to be accepted by the progressive tribe, I say F Donald Trump, free Palestine, climate change is an existential threat. I say all these things to virtue signal. I get accepted by the tribe. But I've also got this other, strategy that evolution wants me to play, of the individual strategy of my own personal reproductive fitness that's at odds with the kind of my group virtue signaling. And
Yeah.
that's a really tough position to be in.
It is, and that is the essence of intersexual competition. Certainly it is for women. I suspect it is for some extent as well to men, although certainly for women, the motivation to be in the tribe, as we've sort of discussed, is much higher. So women are very, very strongly motivated, and I don't think that that's not evolutionary. It's not like that is some sort of social artifact that's getting in the way of, evolved predilections to compete aggressively and take no enemies. That really strong motive that women have is also an evolved motive to keep yourself in the good graces of the dominant women in your group, because ostracism is incredibly dangerous for women's reproductive success. Right? If you're not allowed in the social group, then you're not allowed to mix with the men in that social group, and you're not going to be allowed to find yourself a good partner. You're going to be, you're going to be on the outer, you're going to be shunted. And then you're also not going to have the assistance of other women when it comes to raising children and that kind of help. And so I presume that the selection pressures for women to, keep in the good graces of the group are sufficiently strong that they allow these kinds of really high prices to get in that group, to evolve and to be maintained. So, in order to be selected for, to be willing to pay really high reproductive prices for your spot in the social group means that attaining a spot in that social group and holding on to it must be very, very important ultimately for reproductive success as well. So it's, there's two balancing forces. And, if you're lucky enough to be high enough in the dominance hierarchy that you get to set a price for being in the group, you're the ones who get to decide what is it that we're going to believe, what is it that we're going to endorse, what is it that we're going to allow and not allow. Then you effectively get to set a price that you can afford to pay, that as many people who are just below you in your group cannot afford to pay, and will have to wear tremendous costs if they want to stay in that group. And so it's an irresolvable tension between those two things that allows dominant females with social capital and clout and resources and the ability to manipulate others to set the market price for these things, and to set that price at something they can afford but that other people can't.
So I want to shift gears a little bit, because a lot of this promise of, kind of be a boss babe, focus on your career, you don't want kids and a husband tying you down, go get it, live your best life, the kind of the message is you're going to be miserable if you have a family,
Yeah.
and you're going to have fun and enjoy your life. You just kind of do whatever you want. And Rusty in the chat is talking about how there's an increase since we've adopted that narrative, there's an increase in women on SSRIs. You got these wine moms who are kind of drinking away their, the pointlessness of their life. It's actually having the opposite of the effect of what the kind of the brochure of feminism is telling us.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. To me, that is, one of the indicators that this stuff is not actually, it's wrapped in a really nice, attractive, pro-social, pro-women wrapping, right? Like, oh, this is how you'll live your best life, be a boss girl, have an amazing career. So we make it a palatable, feminism has made itself very palatable messaging by emphasizing how much better women's lives are going to be. But if that was actually the ultimate motive, then one would expect that in the presence of clear evidence that that's not what's happening, that feminist drive would become less popular, and people start saying, well, hang on a minute, this is actually not working for people. We've actually got, increasing numbers of women who are reaching the end of their childbearing years, discovering that, that they're actually now never going to have children, that there is no, oh yeah, maybe one day because it's over, and becoming increasingly depressed and upset about that. There's also, lots of people have observed in a lot of age groups the sex differences in mental health. So women are faring much worse right from sort of, I think, late teens, are faring much worse than men now, and that is really strongly correlated with having a left-wing political orientation. So it does suggest, and given that this particular flavour of antinatalism that we're seeing at the moment is very, very firmly planted within the left. So, I think part of the left-wing, right-wing continuum is that the right is more pronatal generally and the left is more antinatal. So of course, if this is going to become an extreme version of that, we would expect all the antenatal narrative to largely be on the left and much less so on the right. But it does suggest that living within a highly intrasexually competitive environment is not good for your mental health. That's not especially surprising, I think. So I think, yes, there's part of it is that the feminist driven narratives about, you'll live your best life if you don't have children, if you don't get married, if you focus on your career, if you build your own independent wealth and basically reach the age of 50 with, 17 cats or something. That's how you'll be happiest. But of course, it's not working, right? We're not actually seeing women's mental health being better than men, and that's especially true for women who are on the left, who with good reason, we presume are the women who are much more likely to have actually embraced these narratives and taken them to heart and tried to embody them. So I think, yeah, it's the other thing to point out about this as well is that women's the fact that women have a natural biological cap on their reproduction makes strategies like this much more effective as female reproductive suppressants than for male reproductive suppressants. You've only got to convince women that they don't want children until they're around about late 30s, early 40s. And for the majority of women, that's enough. You've done enough damage that they won't be able to reproduce after that. When men figure out in their 40s or 50s, actually, I think it's about time I grew up. This is actually, this is ridiculous. This is not the kind of party life I want to lead. Now, for many men, opportunities will have been lost. Not, most women of reproductive age are not necessarily seeking a 40 or 50-year-old man. But if what the man has done is pour his life's work into becoming, into working 70, 80 hours a week and becoming some big fancy hotshot, whatever he's gone and become, lawyer or whatever, if he has a lot of resources, then he does have opportunities. So younger women will be attracted to older men who have a lot of wealth. So it's not as effective a strategy. If a woman reaches that point in time, it doesn't matter how high her mate quality was. It doesn't matter how competent she is, how clever she is, what she's achieved. It's over. She's been duped. She's lost, right? She will never reproduce. Her lineage ends there. If a man reaches a point in his life where he figures out what's happened, some men at least still have a chance that they can sort of go back and go, okay, from now onwards, I'm actually going to invest my efforts in trying to find a long-term partner and raising a family, even though I'm older than most other men who are trying to do that. So it's a much more effective strategy for women. It's only got to last so long. You don't have to convince them for their whole life not to reproduce and withdraw themselves from the dating pool. You just have to convince them for long enough that they're really, in practical terms, you also don't have to convince them that, for that until they are no longer biologically fertile. You just have to convince them of that until they are of such an age that men who are wanting families see them as too old. So age differences in relationships are not typically extreme, but they are very biased in terms of the men being older. It's much easier for a man in his late 30s. So women in their late 30s are not necessarily completely reproductively finished, but it's much easier for a man in his late 30s to attract a woman in her early 30s or late 20s than it is the other way around. So, women become, reproduction becomes, less viable for women much sooner and becomes unviable at a point where it really never becomes completely unviable for men for both biological and social reasons. So it's a strategy that is always going to work much better with women, this type of just convincing them to delay having children until this has happened or this has happened or this has happened. If you just get them to delay enough, that is damaging enough in a way that it would never be that damaging for men, which is why I think this is largely a female specific strategy.
Hmm. I got a couple questions left, and one, we talk about kind of these shallow signals of fitness that I'll just kind of use that as a term. So, like
Yeah.
a peacock's tail, it's a very shallow signal of fitness who's trying to signal I've got good genetic quality, and amongst humans, you have these shallow signals like a man driving a fancy sports car is a shallow signal. A woman wearing a tight dress would be a shallow signal. My bow tie here is peacocking in a very shallow way. Um, but when we talk about virtue signaling, we're talking about kind of a moral thing. It's something much deeper inside you that you're trying to say has higher quality. In my book, I said someone getting a gender studies degree is a hard to fake signal of fitness when it comes to that type of kind of deeper virtue signaling. What can you tell me about from like an evolutionary psychologist perspective of like that moral aspect of virtue signaling, of trying to signal something deep inside me is superior?
Oh, look, I think it's an interesting dichotomy between the virtue signaling and the other signals of mate quality, but I'm not quite sure that they're shallow. So the bow tie is probably a good example of a shallow signal because it's a cheap thing for you to do. It doesn't really cost you anything, and it's not really committing you to anything either. So it doesn't have any sort of pre-signal costs. It's not a very costly thing to signal at the time you're signaling it, and doesn't really have any post-signal costs either. So that is a sort of cheap signal. But things like, driving around a fancy car, if you actually had to invest a whole heap of your wealth in that car, then driving that around, I mean, once you've got the car, obviously the signal itself is not expensive to give out once you've already bought the car. But there's a lot of pre-signaling cost that goes into actually having the funds to then purchase that car to then be able to drive it around. So a lot of those, and of course, and again, even the woman with the tight dress is also an interesting example because that's an example that could carry potentially costly post-signaling costs. So if you're going to signal yourself, so what women are typically signaling with that type of clothing, in spite of I can already hear the feminist objections, so I'll just apologize in advance, but what women are typically signaling with that type of revealing clothing is something about their mate quality and something about their potential availability. Now, that doesn't mean that they're offering themselves as available to all men. It's more like saying, I'm here, I'm attractive, if you think you're valuable enough, come and, very politely, um, you know, approach me. It's not like, I'm here, I'm wearing a tight dress, so you can come and rape me. It's not that type of signal. However, if you're going to put out a signal of potential sexual availability, then there is obviously the possibility that you might attract a very dangerous male. So that could carry, quite dangerous posts. If you've got no intention at all of just having sex with whatever random guy happens to come up to you while you're wearing this gorgeous dress, you're still nevertheless placing yourself at risk because we also do know from the data that men will target women who are wearing that type of clothing for sexual assault. So that's actually quite a risky signal. You want to show men how attractive you are. You will potentially want to be titillating and at least put out a false or ambiguous signal about your sexual availability, but then you may pay a massive cost for that if you attract the wrong man who either is going to deliberately misinterpret that signal or take that signal as a sign that, he's going to be able to get you to put up, not quite enough resistance early enough for him to be able to get you in a really compromising position, right? So those are actually potentially quite costly signals. I think your bow tie is probably the only one of those that would actually be a shallow signal, right? But there are lots of shallow signals and cheap signals that people give out, particularly cheap signals that they try to pretend are costly signals. Going now to the virtue signaling stuff, I think that's really interesting, a really interesting idea because the virtue signals and, using like a gender studies degree as an example, that takes a really long time to to get, right? So it's, irrespective of, I'm not quite sure that university degrees generally are reliable indicators of being smart. I mean, I think now the statistics are out that the average IQ of a university graduate matches the average IQ of the rest of the population. Like, they are now statistically not actually a signal that you are any more intelligent than anyone else. Look, they might be a signal of your conscientiousness, or there's something other than IQ that makes you more likely to go to university and get a degree. Although I think these days, considering the political landscape of universities, they're probably much more likely just to be a virtue signal in and of themselves, almost regardless of what you've studied. And then, of course, going to university and studying a gender studies degree places you firmly within a particular narrow range of political views. So yeah, that would act as a sort of costly virtue signal, and it's potentially quite costly, of course, if you're investing a certain number of years in university education and not attaining skills or qualifications that are going to lead you to, going to reliably lead you to a job in the future. So it's a very different thing to undertake like a vanity degree like gender studies versus someone that goes to university to study law or medicine or nursing or teaching or something that has a guaranteed career that you graduate into, if you like. The kinds of degrees that don't have a guaranteed career to graduate into must be serving some other purpose in order for people to be flocking to them, like they are to gender studies degrees and things like that.
Mm, mm. So I've asked you this question before. I want to see if your answer differs, and that is, when you look at society more broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
No, I think, see, last time you asked me this, I said birth rate decline, and I think if anything, I've probably strengthened on that. Maybe I guess I might add to that if we wanted to try to come up with something different. I might add to that the rotting, it's the sort of the rotting from the inside out of the meritocracy. I think
Mm.
I think that is, birth rate decline. I think it's much easier to link that to, a social existential crisis. The maths are there. You can draw a graph and you can see when that line is going to hit or asymptote to the axis, right? I think the gutting of the meritocracy of society and the impact that's having on the function of our institutions, I think that's a much harder thing to get a handle on, and people maybe need to talk about that and think about that and theorize about that a little bit more and work out ways to measure that. So there's a lot of parameters and statistics that can feed into that. One sort of especially horrifying one, again, with the caveat that I don't know that it is true, but I saw it in a reliable source. I'm taking it as true, but I welcome people to point out if I'm wrong about this. In the NHS, in some of the NHS trusts, someone did an analysis looking at the amount of money that they spent on what effectively settling compensation claims versus the amount of money that they actually spent on the ward caring for people. And in the maternity units, in some, I don't know what the period of time was, but in some period of time, they actually spent more money on compensation claims for women who had been in the maternity unit and something had gone wrong than the actual cost of running the maternity unit. And that boggles my mind. That's astonishing to think that those costs would even be in the same universe, let alone that they shouldn't be in the same order of magnitude, let alone to actually be, who knows how accurate the stats are, but approaching each other at least is horrifying enough, I think. And I think it's, again, most people who are within the academy, I think, in spite of its reputation for being uniformly left-wing and academics celebrating the left-wingedness of it and thinking it's wonderful, I do think that many, many people within the academy are desperately concerned about the state of the academy, regardless of their own political views, and conversations about what's happening to our institutions and just the decline in the quality of our institutions and the general move away from applying a strict and unforgiving, meritocratic selection process in so many different ways, I think is a conversation that we need to have, because that is going to ultimately, if it's allowed to just continue along these trends, when you've got hospitals giving out more money as compensation for people on a unit than it costs to actually run the unit, something is desperately wrong. And we need to be talking about that, because that is going to bring a society crashing down as much as just not having any people in that society anymore. With birth rate decline. So perhaps, in terms of thinking about what is going wrong with the West, maybe we can put birth rate decline and the gutting of the meritocracy on something of an equal footing, as perhaps the two most immediate threats that we face.
Mm. What do you, just as a follow-up question, what's the incentive behind gutting meritocracy?
I think according to, I mean, there could be many. I think there's a very, very simple, which might have some merit, explanation, which is that if the world is a meritocracy, and you're in the bottom 2/3 of ability, competence, whatever merit it is that we are evaluating people on, and the majority of people are in the bottom 2/3 or the bottom 3/4 by definition, always on everything. That's how merit rankings work. Then you're never going to be up in the upper echelon. And so the very simple explanation is that there's potentially always going to be some push from those who would never win a meritocratic race to decide that they don't want it to be a meritocratic race anymore, because they would never win it if it was. So that's a very simple explanation why there's always going to be some push from, sort of personally, individually interested people to try to undermine the meritocracy, to try to potentially try to cheat it for themselves, or in a collective way to try to actually sort of, bring it down, to try to kind of level the playing field. And I guess one argument that you could put forward for that, or one trigger you could put forward for that, is to say that as societies get wealthier, the other thing that tends to happen is that the wealth inequality increases rather than decreases. So, you can have a society where everybody is equally poor, or you can have a society where everybody is unequally rich, but you can't have a society where everybody's equally rich. And so as societies get wealthier, the gap between the haves and the have-nots increases, and thus the have-nots have got a much stronger motivation to attempt to kind of subvert that, the meritocratic processes that lead them to be the have-nots. So that's one kind of explanation, which probably has some merit, I would imagine. Within sort of my theory of female intersexual competition and the feminization of the institutions in particular, I think that the feminization of the institutions, part of that is an undercutting of meritocracy, because part of that is, say, like, the introduction of the, diversity, equity, inclusion framework, which, has been shown to, it's not being sort of applied in a way that sort of, the way it was always described, or the way maybe not always, but was certainly described for some period of time, is that the principles of DEI were to be applied when merits were equal. So, you assess the candidates for a job, and if you have two equal candidates, then if your department has fewer women, you should appoint the woman. If your department has fewer black people than white people, then you should appoint the black person. So an attempt to use sensitivity to these individual characteristics to increase the diversity of people in a department without disrupting the meritocracy, under the notion, which is probably not an entirely indefensible notion, under the notion that if you have a lot of different people from different backgrounds and different ethnicities, then you will end up with a greater diversity of viewpoints and perspectives. But of course, the way DEI has actually been instantiated, it's actually resulted in an incredibly narrow range of acceptable viewpoints and perspectives. And so, and we've seen it being used to subvert the meritocracy, in really substantial ways. And so, I think part of that is, if I'm sort of, generally correct, or even partly correct, about sort of, women driving reproductive suppression in order to effectively kind of bring down a society, be one of the lineages that's left at the end in order to be the founding population of the rest of society, and thus effectively, be spreading your genes far more than you could trying to compete in a society that's already big. If that's effectively what's happening, then the takedown of the meritocracy would be a rather well-designed part of that process. So you're not just taking women out of motherhood and encouraging them to invest their time and efforts and energies in being boss girls and getting jobs whilst they're in those boss girl positions and getting those jobs and being, playing a role in the civics of a society and in its institutions and in parliament and all these important decision-making places, health, education. Um, if what they then do in those roles is also a very sort of careful, systematic, effective collapse of those institutions, well, that's going to play perfectly into the same end goal as the birth rate decline has. So I don't necessarily think that they have to be theoretically unrelated, but that doesn't mean that I'm right, because there are other explanations for why certain people would potentially benefit from gutting the meritocracy a bit. So
That's a very interesting answer. I'm gonna chew on that for a while. Um, yeah, Dr. Sulikowski, thank you so much for stopping by once again. I always love talking to you.
Oh, I love stopping by. I love nothing more than the opportunity to just speak about things that I find interesting. It's amazing.